Hi, everyone. In this unit, we're talking about something called an archetype. That probably sounds like a pretty difficult literary term that's going to require a big, long definition, but it's really pretty simple. An archetype is a character, situation, symbol, or story pattern that appears again and again across literature and storytelling. Once you start to recognize archetypes, you start seeing them everywhere. Think about how many stories that you've read or seen, if we're thinking about movies, that involve a hero leaving home and going on a dangerous journey, or two brothers who become rivals, or someone who's told you can have anything you want except one thing. You already know what's going to happen there, right? They're going to touch it, they're going to try to get that one thing. That's an archetype. It doesn't mean that these stories copy each other. It just means that human beings still tell these stories of this conflict because they're very human experiences. From the oldest of times, back in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first, full written story that we have, to modern stories. These archetypes are all still very familiar and very relatable. We tell stories about love and death and jealousy, parents and children, brothers and sisters, good and evil, temptation, power and pride, also the desire to know things we're not supposed to know, the fear of death, leaving home and trying to get back home, destroying something and trying to start over again. All of these patterns are incredibly old, but they keep showing up because they're still relating to our modern day human experiences. You've seen archetypes before, so let me give you an easy example. Imagine a story that begins with an ordinary person living an ordinary life, and then suddenly something happens to pull that person away from home. The character enters an unfamiliar world. It faces new dangers, new challenges. It meets helpers, it meets enemies along the way. And there are lots of things going on that change that character because of these experiences that they have. And they eventually have to use those new experiences and the new knowledge they've gained to confront some major challenge. You've seen that story before. Maybe it was in Star Wars, maybe it was Lord of the Rings, or any Marvel movie or Disney movie. They're in novels, anime, even video games. The details change, but the basic pattern does not. That's one thing that archetypes help us realize. So in your notes, I included a form that shows 12 common archetypes for characters, but archetypes aren't just characters. So there are certain character archetypes that are outlined for you in your notes. One's like the hero, one is the teacher or mentor, there's the trickster or jester, the outcast, the innocent, the outlaw, the villain. Those archetypes are pretty common in literature, but archetypes don't have to be characters. They can also be situations, like a journey is an archetype. So is a fall from innocence or sibling rivalry, death and rebirth, exile, like in Heduana dealt with, the battle between good and evil, the quest for something seems impossible to obtain. Archetypes can also be symbols like light. Light can represent knowledge or goodness or revelation. Darkness can represent ignorance or evil or fear. Water can be destruction. It can also be rebirth and cleansing. A garden can be paradise, innocence, or safety, or maybe wilderness becomes danger or isolation, or maybe it's transformational. The thing is, the meanings for all of these symbols are not always automatic. Water does not always mean rebirth, and darkness doesn't always mean evil. And for those stories, context really matters. But these associations appear often enough that writers can use them, knowing that readers can recognize the pattern. So let's talk about Genesis and archetypes. Now, we are looking at several different stories from Genesis in this unit. Whether you approach Genesis as sacred scripture, ancient literature, or maybe both, its influence on later literature and its culture is enormous. That's why we're reading these stories. So think about the stories we're reading. We're going to start with creation. In the creation story, the world moves from formless and darkness, order, to light, life, and humanity. So creation itself has this archetypal pattern. Something comes from nothing, chaos comes from order, and a world begins. Then we get Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They live in paradise. There's something they want. They're not supposed to have it, which makes them want it more. So what happens? They're tempted. They take what's been forbidden. They gain knowledge they're not supposed to have. And that knowledge comes with consequences. Their innocence is gone. They're kicked out of paradise. And that becomes a pattern we've seen countless times. Temptation leads to forbidden knowledge, which leads to loss of innocence, which leads to consequences. Think about how many stories involve a character that discovers something they weren't supposed to know. Maybe they've opened a forbidden door, or they've read it in a forbidden book. They've conducted a forbidden experiment. Maybe they used technology that humans weren't ready for. They've asked a question that everyone warned them not to ask. All of those are different stories, but the same basic pattern. We're also going to read about Cain and Abel. They're two brothers. One becomes jealous of the other. Jealousy becomes resentment. Resentment becomes violence. And that pattern doesn't just stay in Genesis. Sibling rivalry is a very common, persistent conflict in literature. Brothers compete for lots of things, for love, for inheritance, or power, or approval, maybe a throne, maybe recognition. And sometimes that conflict becomes destructive. And it's not just brothers, it can be sisters, brothers and sisters, it can be cousins. You get the idea. It's about that competition. When you encounter that pattern in a story written hundreds of thousands of years later, you've recognized an archetype. We're also going to read about the Great Flood. You've already encountered another ancient flood when we backtrack to read the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's important that Gilgamesh included that flood story. The flood is not an archetype because Genesis invented the idea of a catastrophic flood. Flood traditions existed in ancient cultures long before biblical tradition was established. That matters most for our recurring pattern, right? Humanity faces destruction, a small group survives, the old world disappears, and life starts again. It's about destruction and renewal, death and rebirth, the end of one world and the beginning of another. And we still tell that story today in movies like, I don't know, zombie apocalypse movies, stories about nuclear destruction, stories about civilizations destroyed by climate catastrophe, disease, or aliens, machines, or war. All of those things start to sound remarkably similar, right? If our world ended, what would we save and what kind of world would we build afterward? It's a question people have been asking themselves since the beginning of time. We still ask it today. Again, I want to emphasize that archetype, just because you recognize archetypes in different pieces of literature or different movies, as the case may be, that doesn't mean that the stories are exactly the same. So you can share an archetype and not have the same story. They share kind of like a skeleton, like we all have skeletons in us, right? Bones and stuff. And if we were to look at our skeletons, they would all look very similar. However, if you look at us on the outside, we look very different. That's the same with these stories. They have the same skeleton with these archetypes, but the stories themselves are very different. So sibling rival does not always have to end with murder like Cain and Abel. And a forbidden knowledge story does not always need to have a serpent or a piece of fruit in it. So I want you to keep that in your mind as you're reading. And these differences really are part of what makes studying world literature interesting. So why are we spending time on these patterns? Instead of saying what happens in the story, who was the main character, what did the main character do? Instead of asking those questions, I want you to look at something a little different. I want you to say, where have I seen this pattern before? And then what has the writer done differently with it? When you start asking those kinds of questions, that's literary analysis. So we can learn things about different cultures from that kind of analysis. It tells us about cultural values. It tells us about a particular era's beliefs in human nature. or maybe even questions that they were trying to answer. So keep that in mind as you read through these assignments this week. I guess overall, the big thing that I want you to remember here, the big idea from this unit, is that human beings have been storytelling for thousands of years. But many of those things we tell stories about have not changed very much at all. As humans, we're still afraid of death. We're still tempted by things we can't have or shouldn't have. We get jealous. We get ambitious. We want knowledge. We make mistakes. We lose things and people that we love. Sometimes we get far off track and we try to get back, whether that's home or a goal or something like that. The people in our lives, characters change. Our settings may change. Our languages may change. But those patterns keep coming back time and time again. And those patterns are archetypes. And once you learn to see them, you will start finding them everywhere.